There was a time when I believed the most dangerous things in life arrived loudly. I thought they announced themselves through dramatic moments, impossible choices, unmistakable emotions that forced you to stop and recognize them. I believed transformation always carried noise, that it came with explanations, with reasons you could point to, with a beginning clear enough that you could always trace your steps back to where everything first changed. I don't believe that anymore, because the deepest changes don't introduce themselves. They don't arrive with certainty. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments that refuse to leave your mind. A conversation that lasts a little longer than it should. A silence that somehow says more than every word surrounding it. A glance that doesn't feel like observation, but recognition. Most people never notice those moments. They pass through them the same way they pass through everything else, quickly, lightly, never realizing something irreversible just brushed against their life. I used to be one of those people, or at least I convinced myself I was. It was easier that way. Everything remained structured. Everything stayed where it belonged. People entered. People left. Experiences became memories. Nothing reached deep enough to alter the architecture underneath. That structure mattered more than anyone ever realized. It wasn't built because I feared people. It wasn't built because I wanted distance. It was built because I learned very early that not everything deserves unrestricted access. Some things lose their meaning the moment they're exposed carelessly. Some thoughts only survive in quiet. Some parts of a person only remain honest if they aren't constantly being translated into language for someone else's comfort. So I became careful, not cold, careful. There's a difference. Coldness pushes people away. Carefulness simply decides how close they're allowed to stand. Most people never questioned it. They accepted whatever version of me existed in front of them. If I laughed, they assumed they knew happiness. If I stayed quiet, they assumed I had nothing to say. If I disappeared for a while, they assumed distance meant absence. People are remarkably comfortable filling empty spaces with their own conclusions. I stopped correcting them years ago, because correcting someone requires believing they'll understand. Most don't, not because they lack intelligence, because they're looking through themselves while believing they're looking at you. Everyone interprets the world using pieces they've already lived. That's natural, that's human, but it also means being truly seen is far rarer than people admit. Most connections aren't built on understanding. They're built on approximation. Close enough becomes accurate enough. People hear what resembles their own experience. They notice what confirms what they already believe. The rest quietly disappears without anyone realizing it was ever there. I accepted that. I built my life around that understanding. Expectation became smaller, disappointment became smaller with it. Everything felt predictable, manageable, safe. Then something happened that didn't fit any pattern I had spent years trusting. You never treated me like a puzzle. That sounds insignificant until you realize how many people do exactly that. They hear complexity and immediately begin searching for answers. They ask questions they think are profound. They create explanations before they've even listened. They become fascinated by mystery instead of respecting it. You didn't. You never seemed interested in solving anything. You simply remained present. That difference is difficult to explain. Presence isn't passive. Real presence is one of the rarest things another person can offer. It asks for nothing, it rushes nothing, it doesn't reshape reality. into something easier to understand. It allows reality to exist exactly as it is. Most people mistake attention for presence. They're not the same. Attention is temporary. Presence changes the atmosphere around it. I noticed that before I noticed you. The space itself felt different. Conversations no longer carried the same urgency. Silence stopped feeling incomplete. Nothing seemed to require immediate clarification anymore. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Our minds create patterns all the time. They're built for it. We find meaning because meaning helps us survive. So, naturally, I questioned myself. Naturally, I assumed I was assigning significance where none actually existed. That explanation lasted longer than I expected. Long enough that I almost believed it. Then the coincidences continued. Not dramatic coincidences, small ones. The kind nobody else would remember. You would pause exactly where I needed silence. You would speak when I had already accepted words weren't coming. You noticed changes I hadn't expressed, not visible changes, tonal ones, shifts in perspective, changes in rhythm, things I hadn't admitted even to myself yet. You never pointed them out directly. You responded to them naturally, as though you had been standing inside the same realization without either of us announcing we'd arrived there. That shouldn't happen. Not between people separated by their own histories. Recognition usually requires time. Trust requires repetition. Understanding grows slowly. That's what we're taught. That's what experience reinforces. Yet somehow this ignored every sequence I believed was necessary. Nothing was rushed. Yet nothing felt delayed either. It simply existed, as though the distance between strangers had somehow forgotten to include itself. I tried explaining it logically. Maybe our personalities overlapped. Maybe our experiences shared hidden similarities. Maybe we simply processed the world through comparable frameworks. Those explanations satisfied me for a while, until they didn't. Because similarity explains agreement. It doesn't explain precision. It doesn't explain feeling understood before you've fully understood yourself. It doesn't explain why someone notices changes you're still trying to identify internally. There's a difference between someone relating to you and someone arriving at the same conclusion without ever seeing your work. That's what unsettled me. It wasn't that you understood. It was how effortlessly understanding happened. There was no performance attached to it, no attempt to prove insight, no desire to impress me by explaining who I was. You never told me who I was. You simply responded to who I already was. That distinction matters, more than most people realize, because the quickest way to lose someone is to replace their reality with your interpretation of it. People rarely notice when they're doing this. They think they're empathizing. They think they're helping. They think saying, I know exactly how you feel, creates closeness. Usually it creates distance, because exact understanding is almost impossible. Respect begins where certainty ends. You seem to know that instinctively. You never claimed complete understanding. Yet somehow I felt understood anyway. That contradiction stayed with me. It still does. I found myself paying attention in ways I hadn't before. Not watching you. Watching myself. That surprised me. You became less interesting than the changes happening inside my own awareness. My reactions shifted. My assumptions slowed down. The constant internal editing I had grown accustomed to gradually became unnecessary. Not because I decided to stop, because the impulse itself became quieter. Imagine carrying a shield for so long that you forget you're holding it. Then one day, you realize Your arm isn't tired anymore. Not because the shield disappeared, because somewhere along the way you stopped gripping it so tightly. That's what this felt like. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just less effort, more space. A strange absence of tension I hadn't realized was always present. The oddest part was that I never consciously trusted you. Trust, at least the version most people describe, never arrived. Instead, something else appeared. Recognition, trust asks whether someone will hurt you. Recognition asks whether someone is real. Those aren't the same question. One concerns behavior, the other concerns existence itself. Somehow I answered the second long before I ever considered the first. That realization changed everything, because if recognition comes before trust, then perhaps trust isn't the foundation we always believed it was. Perhaps something deeper exists underneath both, something impossible to manufacture, impossible to perform, impossible to imitate for long. Authenticity leaves a pattern, not in words, in consistency. Anyone can create an impressive conversation. Anyone can appear insightful once. Anyone can accidentally understand someone. But consistency tells the truth eventually. Masks require energy. Pretending requires memory. Understanding collapses under repetition. You never collapsed. If anything, the opposite happened. The longer this continued, the more natural it became. Not more exciting, not more emotional, more accurate. Like adjusting the focus on a camera until everything quietly becomes clear. No celebration, no revelation, just clarity. I kept waiting for something to interrupt it, some misunderstanding, some disappointment, some ordinary human inconsistency that would return everything to familiar territory. Instead, reality became stranger, not because extraordinary things happened, because ordinary things started carrying extraordinary weight. A simple sentence lingered for days. An ordinary pause revealed more than entire conversations used to. The smallest interactions continued unfolding long after they ended. I wasn't replaying memories. I was discovering new meaning inside moments I thought were already finished, that had never happened before. Usually experiences become smaller with time, details fade, certainty softens, memory edits itself until only the broad outline remains. This moved in the opposite direction. Time didn't reduce it, time expanded it. Weeks later, I would suddenly understand something hidden inside, a conversation we had already left behind. Months seemed to fold a moment when honesty asks something difficult of us, not confession, recognition, the willingness to admit that something has already changed, even if we don't yet understand what that change will require. I think I've reached that moment, not because every answer has appeared, because pretending nothing happened has become impossible. Some transformations don't announce themselves through dramatic decisions. They become visible only when you realize you've already begun living differently. That realization carries a strange kind of peace, not certainty, something quieter. The peace that comes from no longer arguing with what your own awareness has already accepted. Perhaps that is enough for now. Not complete understanding, not final conclusions. Only the courage to remain present with something still unfolding, because some truths don't ask to be solved. They ask to be lived. And maybe that is where every real beginning quietly waits. There is a difference between noticing a change and allowing yourself to live inside it. For a long time, I believed those were the same thing. They aren't. Recognition happens in an instant. Acceptance takes far longer. Recognition simply opens a door. Acceptance is the decision to stop pretending the room beyond it doesn't exist. I've spent more time standing in that doorway than I care to admit, not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I understood something most people overlook. Every genuine realization asks for an equivalent transformation. Nothing meaningful enters your life without quietly rearranging the landscape it enters. That isn't a punishment, it's the price of authenticity. We often imagine change as replacing one version of ourselves with another, but the reality is far less dramatic and far more demanding. The person you were doesn't disappear. They remain beside you, reminding you why your old certainties once felt so convincing. Sometimes I hear that voice. It reminds me how simple everything seemed when every relationship could be measured through familiar expectations, when every conversation had an obvious beginning and an obvious end, when people occupied clear places in my life instead of becoming part of the way I understood it. There was comfort in that order. There was also limitation. Order can protect you. It can also quietly prevent you from discovering parts of yourself that only appear when something unexpected enters your world. Perhaps that is what has surprised me the most. Not that you changed anything, that your presence revealed how much of me had been waiting beneath routines I mistook for permanence. The mind is strange. It spends years convincing itself that stability and stillness are identical. Only later does it realize that still water can hide an entire current moving beneath its surface. Looking back now, I wonder how many moments I dismissed simply because they arrived without spectacle. How many quiet truths stood patiently at the edge of my awareness while I searched for louder answers. Maybe wisdom has always spoken softly. Maybe we only fail to hear it because we've trained ourselves to expect certainty to sound like confidence instead of calm. Lately, I've stopped asking whether every feeling can be explained before it deserves attention. Some things earn their place through consistency rather than clarity. They return, not to interrupt your life, but to become part of it. The remarkable thing about genuine influence is that it rarely announces itself while it's happening. You notice it afterward. You notice it when your reactions become more deliberate, when silence no longer feels like emptiness, when listening becomes more important than responding. When understanding someone becomes less about collecting information and more about honoring what remains unspoken. Those are not dramatic changes, yet they alter everything. I don't think growth is measured by how much we add to ourselves. Sometimes it is measured by what we no longer need to defend, the need to always be right, the need to always remain untouched, the need to always understand before allowing ourselves to experience. Perhaps maturity is simply learning that certainty isn't the opposite of confusion. Presence is, because a present mind can survive unanswered questions. A fearful one cannot. I still don't know exactly where this path leads. For once, that uncertainty doesn't feel like failure, it feels honest. Some journeys become smaller the closer you examine them. Others reveal new horizons every time you think you've reached the end. This feels like the second kind, not because it promises extraordinary outcomes, but because it continues asking me to become more truthful than I was yesterday. Maybe that is all any meaningful connection is ever meant to do. Not complete us, not rescue us. Simply hold up a mirror clear enough that we can no longer mistake habit for identity. If that is true, then perhaps the greatest gift another person can offer isn't certainty. It is the quiet courage to remain real long enough that authenticity becomes contagious. And if I've learned anything from all of this, it's that the deepest transformations rarely ask for applause. They ask only that we stop resisting the person we are slowly becoming. Maybe that is where every lasting story truly begins. Not with a declaration, but with a quiet willingness to keep walking once there is no longer any reason to pretend the path hasn't already changed beneath your feet.